I've crossed more battlefields than I can count, but I have never felt silence like this. The wind is warm, almost like breath. It slides across the grass and the ash, and it's so quiet that I can hear the waterskins rubbing against saddles and the soft crack of charcoal splitting in the fire. Little sounds, harmless sounds. And yet, tonight, every little sound feels like a verdict. Ahead of me, in the darkness, two black ridges rise from the earth like horns. The locals call them the horns of Hattin. Some Bedouin whisper that something old is chained beneath that volcanic stone, something that wakes when men become greedy, when pride becomes louder than reason. I don't fear stone demons, but I fear thirst. Thirst is a god that needs no temple. It doesn't demand prayers. It only needs heat, distance, and a foolish decision. A scout kneels in the dust and lowers his eyes. He tells me the Frankish army has left the last reliable water. They're moving through dry ground, heavy armor, heavy horses, men who believe their faith will carry them farther than their canteens. I look toward the horizon, where faint dots of fire tremble like dying stars. That is Guy of Lusignan, new king of Jerusalem, leading what they call the finest of the West. Knights in iron, banners marked with crosses, men who have never learned that metal becomes an oven when the sun is cruel. I give quiet orders. Keep our fires low. Hide the ranks behind the slopes. Let the horse archers ride close, sting them, disappear, return again. No grand clash yet. Tonight, I don't want their blood. I want their sleep. I want their strength. I want their certainty. Because tomorrow, certainty will break before steel does. And as the wind shifts, another name returns to me, like a thorn pressed into the palm. Reynaud of Chateau. A man who calls himself a lord, but lives like a bandit wrapped in prayer. A man who treats treaties like scraps of cloth to wipe clean a blade. His caravan he attacked was moving under truce, under oath, under the expectation that even enemies can recognize a line they do not cross. Reynaud crossed it anyway. He took the goods. He took the people. He laughed at the very idea of restraint. I sent him a message. Return what you have taken. Keep the covenant. He threw my words to the ground. Some men insult you for profit. Some men insult you because they enjoy watching the world burn. That day, I made a vow. If God places that man in my hands, I will end him with my own hands, so that both sides remember that a promise is not a decoration, it is a foundation. And still, I know this war cannot be fought on anger alone. If I want the empire behind me to move as one, Egypt, Syria, the cities, the tribes, the scholars, the soldiers, then I must give them more than orders. I must give them meaning. A story large enough for men to place their lives inside it. And that story did not begin tonight. It began long before Hattin. It began with a city people still speak of like a wound, Edessa. They say that in the year 1144, Imad ad-Din Zingi took Edessa and shocked the Latin world. But Zingi did not live long after his triumph. Within 2 years, he was killed, cut down by a servant in the dark, as if history itself had decided to punish arrogance. His land split, his family divided, but war did not divide. War only changed hands. His son, Nur ad-Din Zingi, rose in Aleppo, sharp-eyed, relentless, a man who carried his father's momentum and turned it into something larger, something disciplined, something holy in the minds of his people. They say that when the Second Crusade failed before the walls of Damascus, it became Nur ad-Din's moment, not because he had won a single battle that day, but because he had outlasted kings who believed God owed them victory. On the 29th of June, 1149, at Inab, he smashed the army of Antioch and killed Prince Raymond. The head was sent east as a trophy, an announcement to the world that the tide could turn. Men flocked to his banner. His prestige grew. Mosul came under his influence. Damascus fell in the year 1154. And then, in 1159, when the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I asserted control of Antioch, Nur ad-Din did something the Franks rarely understood. He made alliances when it served strategy, and he broke them when it served survival. He secured a northern border. He bought himself room to expand. He worked to hold Syria together because he understood the simplest truth of this land. A divided house can pray all it wants, it will still fall. And while he did this, far to the south, Egypt began to rot from within. The Fatimid Caliphate, rich, proud, unstable, fractured into rival factions. Their leaders changed like masks. Their palaces glittered while their foundations cracked. King Amalek of Jerusalem smelled opportunity and sent his army toward the Nile Delta. The Fatimids, desperate, invited Nur ad-Din to intervene, offering a great share of Egypt's revenue in exchange for help against their enemies. Nur ad-Din answered by sending one of his fiercest Kurdish generals, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh. And with Shirkuh went a young man, quiet, observant, more scholar than warrior at first. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Me. That is where the road truly begins. Not in a throne room, not on a battlefield, but in the moment you step into a land of wealth, betrayal, and shifting loyalties, and realize that if you do not shape it, it will shape you. Tonight, beneath the horns of Hattin, I can feel all those years pressing toward a single breath. Tomorrow, thirst will speak, and the world will listen. When I marched toward Jerusalem, I didn't see a city. I saw a name that had dragged knights across the sea, a name that had kept this land living under the shadow of war for generations, a name that made every prayer, Christian and Muslim, feel heavier than it should. Jerusalem sat high on its ridge like a cold brow, watching everything below, and its walls were not only stone, they were memory. When my army closed a ring around it, I gave an order that some of my commanders did not expect. Tighten the siege, yes, but do not unleash chaos. Do not turn victory into a frenzy. Because I remembered what happened when the Franks took Jerusalem long ago, when they entered in blood and the city became a scream that echoed for decades. I could take the holy city that way, but if I did, I would not be ending a war. I would be planting a curse. Still, I could not afford time. Every day outside those walls pulled at the edges of my power. Egypt, Syria, the roads, the borders, the rivalries. A long siege can ruin the victor as easily as it ruins the defeated. Inside Jerusalem, the Franks found a man to hold the last line. Balian of Ibelin. He wasn't a king. He wasn't the man who started this war. But history doesn't always hand its hardest burdens to the ones who crave them. Sometimes it chooses the one who refuses to fall apart. Balian gathered what was left. Boys too young for armor, old men who should have been at home, survivors who still smelled the smoke of Hattin. He gave them order, and he gave them purpose. And to my surprise, Jerusalem resisted. Our siege engines threw stone that sounded like thunder you could touch. Their arrows answered from the walls like iron rain. Day after day, the city held, and day after day my men grew tired, not from defeat, but from the slow grind of time. Then Balian asked to speak. A messenger came first, then another, and finally Balian himself. He did not come crawling. He stood before me with the posture of a man who knew he spoke for everyone behind the walls. Women, children, the sick, the poor, people who did not choose this war, but would pay for it. He asked for mercy. He asked for safe surrender. He asked for amnesty. I didn't answer right away. At first, my heart reached for old anger. I remembered the slaughter from the year 1099, how blood had flowed in streets and holy places. In this land, memory never truly dies. It just waits. But Jerusalem is not like other cities. Here, even the final sentence must be weighed like gold. Then Balian said something that chilled the air. He told me that if there was no mercy, there would be nothing left to rule. That if the city was doomed, they would destroy what they could before they died. They would kill Muslim prisoners held inside. They would burn homes. They would tear down what was sacred. They would turn Jerusalem into ash, so no one, neither Frank nor Muslim, could claim a true victory. It was the threat of a desperate man, but it was also a warning. Even the conqueror can lose by winning the wrong way. I looked at him and I thought of the lessons that shaped me. I thought of Nur ad-Din, who taught that war must end in order, not endless revenge. I thought of Cairo, where I learned that a ruler's strongest fortress is not a wall, but the loyalty of ordinary people. I thought of Hattin, where I had kept an oath with blood, because an empire cannot stand on empty words. And I understood something clearly. If I took Jerusalem with slaughter, I might satisfy a moment of rage and create a century of resistance. So I made a decision that would define my name more than any single battle. Jerusalem would not be taken by massacre. It would be taken by terms. I offered conditions that were firm, but not cruel by the standards of our age. People could ransom themselves. Families could buy freedom. Those without money would not simply be abandoned. Many would be helped by ransoms raised by others. Christian holy sites would be protected. Pilgrims would still be allowed to come peacefully. Some would call that weakness, but I knew it was strength. Because I did not want a city of corpses. I wanted legitimacy, a future, a peace that could actually hold. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem opened its gates. When I entered the city, I did not ride like a man drunk on triumph. I moved like someone placing his hands on something fragile. I felt the weight of every eye, my soldiers, the people of the city, and the invisible eyes of history. My men like to tell a story about that day. They say that when I stepped through the gate, the wind changed direction, that the harsh air softened as if the city itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. I will not claim miracles, but I will tell you what I felt. I looked upon the dome of the rock, gold above ancient stone, and for a moment the noise of war fell away. I did not feel childish joy. I felt responsibility, like a judge who knows his verdict will echo far beyond his lifetime. Jerusalem was mine, and at the same time, I sensed the next storm forming. Across the sea, bells would be ringing, oaths would be sworn, kings would begin to move. Tyre still held on the coast, stubborn, defiant, impossible to crush quickly. That single surviving thorn would become the gathering point for what remained of the Frankish world. And somewhere far away, in the west, a man would hear that Jerusalem had fallen and feel it like a drumbeat inside his ribs. A king forged in war. A king they would call the Lionheart. And I knew, without ever seeing his face, that the next chapter would not be fought against frightened lords and divided councils. It would be fought against a will as hard as iron. Cairo is not a city you simply enter. Cairo is a living thing, golden on the surface, restless underneath. A place where power moves like heat rising from stone. You can't grab it, but you can feel it everywhere. When my uncle, Shirkuh, marched into Cairo in the year 1169, he took the position of vizier with the force of a storm. He crushed opposition fast, the way a soldier does when he's been sent to finish a mission and leave no loose ends behind. And then, just as quickly, he was gone. 2 months later, Shirkuh died. Some men whispered about poison, some said it was simply fate. No one could prove anything, and in Cairo, what you cannot prove can still kill you if you speak it aloud. What mattered was the silence he left behind. The palace became a room full of people holding their breath. Everyone looked around, not asking who deserved the chair, but who could survive sitting in it. And then they looked at me. I was not the obvious choice. I was not the loudest. I was not the most feared. In truth, I believe Nur ad-Din chose me because he thought I would be easy to manage, young enough to obey, polite enough to bend. So I did what a wise man does when he is being underestimated. I bowed. I swore loyalty to Nur ad-Din. I spoke the words with sincerity because I did not see myself as a traitor. I saw myself as a servant of order. And at that moment, Nur ad-Din was the symbol of order in Syria. But Cairo changes a man, because Cairo teaches you something Damascus cannot. There are battles fought without swords, and they are often the ones you cannot afford to lose. As vizier, I began to work, quietly at first. Egypt was still officially under the old Fatimid rule, and the land was tangled in sectarian tension, rival factions, and fragile alliances. If I moved too fast, the entire country could shatter in my hands. If I moved too slow, someone else would cut me down before I had finished my first prayer. So I moved with patience. I began building a military force that answered to me personally, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. In a court of shifting loyalties, the only reliable shield is the one you have forged yourself. I placed trusted men, many from my own family, in positions where they could hold the government steady. Some would call it nepotism, but in a nest of vipers, you do not hand your back to strangers and call it virtue. And while the palace watched for drama, I focused on the arteries of power, money, trade, and the sea. I restored and protected trade routes. I strengthened the ports. I built a fleet, because whoever controls Egypt's coast controls the flow of wealth, and whoever controls wealth controls time. Soon the coin began to pour in. With that wealth, I did something that surprised even my allies. I gave it away. I sponsored schools, libraries, places where knowledge could grow. I invested in public works. I wanted Egypt to feel stability, not as a threat, but as relief. And I made sure support reached the holy cities as well, so that my name became associated not only with government, but with devotion. In Cairo, people began to speak my name with something like gratitude. And that, more than any army, is what made Nur ad-Din uneasy. Because a ruler can tolerate a rich subordinate, he can even tolerate a capable subordinate. But a subordinate who becomes beloved, that is when suspicion becomes unavoidable. Nur ad-Din sent word, return to Damascus at once. I read his message and felt the weight behind it. It was not a request, it was a test. If I returned, I would be walking into a city where my lord's trust had turned into doubt. I would be standing before an emperor of Syria who now looked at me and wondered whether I had become a rival. And in our world, a rival does not remain alive for long. So I answered with excuses. I said Egypt was not stable yet. I said the enemies here were not fully defeated.
I said I could not abandon the administration without risking chaos. All of it was partly true, but not fully. The deeper truth was simpler. I had begun to understand what Egypt truly was. Egypt was not a province. Egypt was a pillar. And if I held that pillar, I could hold the future. Nur ad-Din did not believe my excuses. He saw through them the way a seasoned commander sees through smoke. In the year 1174, he raised a massive army and prepared to march south towards Egypt. I understood what that meant. If he came, he would not come to negotiate. He would come to reclaim what he believed was his and to remove the man he feared might not yield it. And I won't pretend I felt brave in that moment. I felt cornered. My rightful lord was preparing to descend upon me with overwhelming force. I would have to prove my loyalty or prove my strength, and either path could end with my head on a spear. And then history intervened with the cold indifference it often shows to human plans. Just as Nur ad-Din was about to lead his army, he fell ill. The illness tightened around him quickly like a rope, and within days, on the 15th of May, 1174, Nur ad-Din died in Damascus. His heir was a child, 11 years old. When the news reached me, I did not celebrate. I did not pray for a miracle. I did what a man does when the ground beneath him suddenly collapses and reveals a new path. I moved. I rode to Damascus under the pretense of paying respect to my sovereign. I entered the city as a mourner, but I carried myself like someone who understood what a vacuum of power can become if you leave it unfilled. When the people welcomed me, my reputation had arrived before I did, my piety, my generosity, my discipline. And I realized as I passed through the gates, once the crowd begins to believe you belong at the center of the story, it becomes far easier to step into the role. Nur ad-Din's death did not end the conflict in my soul. It began the next one. Because from that moment on, the question was no longer whether I would survive Cairo. The question was whether I would dare to unite what had been divided, Egypt and Syria, wealth and faith, the sword and the law, into a single force strong enough to face the Franks and strong enough to withstand itself.
When Nur ad-Din died, Syria became a room with the door torn off its hinges. Power does that. The moment the hand disappears, everyone rushes to grab the blade. I entered Damascus under the excuse of mourning. My reputation arrived before I did. People called me disciplined, pious, generous. They welcomed me not like a stranger, but like a familiar shape returning to its place. And once I was inside the gates, I moved quickly. I did what this land always demands from anyone who wants to survive. I made my claim legitimate. I married Nur ad-Din's widow, and I stepped into the role of regent for his young heir. In public, I spoke of duty. In private, I understood the truth. If Syria remained divided, it would be eaten alive by rivals, by crusaders, by its own ambition. Not everyone accepted me. The Zingid family resisted. Allies wavered. Cities hesitated. So I brought the only argument that settles hesitation in this age: force. It wasn't the slow war, it was a lightning campaign. Marches that came without warning, decisions made before my enemies realized the question had already been answered. By the time the dust cleared, most of Syria was in my grasp. And when Aleppo fell into my hands in the year 1183, I finally stood where I had always needed to stand, between Egypt and Syria, holding the hinge of the region. From that moment, the Franks could no longer face me as a collection of scattered rulers. They would have to face a single power. But I did not rush to strike, because I had already learned what arrogance costs. Years earlier, in the year 1177, I invaded the kingdom of Jerusalem, believing my numbers would carry me. I dispersed my forces. I underestimated a boy king, Baldwin IV, young, brilliant, and already marked with leprosy. He moved fast, he struck harder than anyone expected. At Montgisard, he smashed my army and nearly killed me. I escaped, but not with pride. I escaped with a lesson carved into my memory. A single mistake can make your enemies believe you can be beaten forever. After that, I fought more carefully. I rebuilt. I won victories, but I did not gamble my future on emotion. And for a time, even war grew tired. In the year 1180, drought and exhaustion forced both sides to accept a truce. It was not peace, it was a pause. Two armies breathing at the same time, each one watching the other's chest rise and fall. Then, in the year 1185, Baldwin IV died. Before he died, he secured a longer truce, 4 years, because he understood something the men around him often forgot. The Crusader states were nearly surrounded. They could not afford constant war. I agreed to that truce because I had my own problems to finish in the east. A final Zingid stronghold still held out in Mosul, and I needed time to close the last cracks in my power. But inside the Kingdom of Jerusalem, stability collapsed. Baldwin had no direct heir. His nephew, Baldwin V, was crowned as a child and then died soon after. And with that death, the throne passed to Baldwin's sister, Sibylla, who crowned her husband, Guy of Lusignan. Guy was not born for this crown. He had ambition, but not the authority to hold his lords together. In a kingdom built on discipline and unity, that weakness was fatal. And then there was Reynaud of Chatillon. Reynaud was the kind of man who treated war like a personal pleasure. Years earlier, he had been captured and imprisoned in Aleppo for 16 years. When he was released, his hatred had only sharpened. He became a fierce warrior and a louder menace. From his fortress of Karak, he sat like a dagger over the trade and pilgrimage routes. When the truce allowed caravans to travel again, Reynaud couldn't resist. He raided them anyway. Baldwin IV had tried to restrain him, but after Baldwin's death, restraint died with him. Then, early in the year 1187, a wealthy caravan moved from Cairo to Damascus. It traveled with light protection, trusting the truce. Reynaud struck it, seized the goods, imprisoned the people, and refused to make restitution. He acted as if he was beyond every promise, beyond every oath. And when I heard, anger did not explode in me. It settled, like a coal that burns hotter the longer you keep it. I sent him a message demanding the return of what he had taken. He treated my words with contempt. And in that contempt, I saw an opening. Because Reynaud's crime was more than robbery. It was a public insult to the idea of order itself. It gave me something that unites an empire faster than gold, a righteous cause. I protested to Guy of Lusignan. Guy was shocked. He demanded Reynaud make restitution. Reynaud refused. He declared, in effect, that he was lord in his own land and owed no truth to Arabs. And just like that, the kingdom of Jerusalem cracked from the inside. A divided enemy is a gift, but gifts still must be used. I gathered my army from across my dominions, Egypt, Syria, the cities, the tribes. The empire moved like a single body. In May of 1187, I struck a Frankish force at Crusade. They chased what they thought was a retreat, and it became a trap. Most were wiped out. But that was only the opening blow. The true plan was larger. I needed the Franks to leave their water. I needed them to march into the heat, into the empty ground, into a place where their armor would become a furnace. So I laid siege to Tiberias. I knew their council would argue. Some would advise caution, to stay near water and force me to come to them. But I also knew Guy's weakness, the fear of appearing timid. He chose haste over sense. He marched his army across dry land, pushing forward without enough water, without enough rest. And as they moved, my horse archers followed them like shadows, harassing, cutting at the edges, stealing sleep. At night, my men raided their camp, and when the moment was right, we set the dry grass burning, so smoke rolled over their column and filled their lungs with panic. By the morning of July 4th, they were no longer marching as an army. They were dragging themselves forward like men already condemned. Ahead of them rose 2 black peaks, an extinct volcanic ridge with twin horns, Hattin. I watched them approach, and I felt the world narrowing down to a single point. Because I knew what was coming. Not just a battle, a turning.
I tightened my grip on the reins and looked out over the slopes where my men waited in silence. And in my mind, only one thought remained. Now.
The morning wind slid over burnt grass, carrying dust and sweat. In front of me, the Frankish army was no longer marching like an army. They were dragging themselves forward, like a coffin made of iron. Their banners were still raised, their crosses still stood tall, but their bodies had begun to betray their faith. You can pray in armor, but you cannot drink prayers. And on this land, water is the first law. I stood on dark volcanic rock, where the Bedouins say the earth once sealed something ancient beneath two jagged peaks. They call them the horns of Hattin. Some of my men whisper that a spirit lives there, a god of thirst, older than empires, older than scripture, waiting for proud men to step too far from the wells. I don't worship desert spirits, but I respect the rules of the desert. This land doesn't kill you with a sword first. It kills you with distance, with heat, with thirst. And when Guy of Luciano chose to leave the water behind, he stepped onto the road of the dead without realizing it. My horse archers were only the bell that rang at the door of fate, ringing again and again until the door finally opened. I kept my orders simple. Circle them, sting them, never let them rest. My riders moved like shadows around their column, not charging into their steel, just cutting the edges, striking the weak points, targeting horses, forcing stops, forcing panic. A knight without his horse is still dangerous, but he is no longer a storm. He is just a man trapped inside metal under a burning sun. And then we used the land itself. Dry grass caught fire easily. Smoke rolled across the slopes, sliding into the seams of their armor, into their eyes, into their lungs. Men who have never been truly thirsty begin to see the world as a hallucination. They start to mistake hope for reality. And once an army starts following hallucinations, it stops being an army at all. By the time the sun rose high, the Franks were funneling towards Hattin, pressed inward like water forced into a narrow channel. They were collapsing into a bowl of rock and heat. Some of their knights dismounted, not out of strategy, but because even the horses were breaking. Others stumbled, and you could see it in their movements, the moment when pride tries to carry the body and fails. I heard their horns, harsh, cracked, desperate. Not a call to victory, a call to survive. And that was when I knew the battle was already turning. Not because we had struck the final blow, but because thirst had already started collecting its debt. I did not want a wild slaughter. I did not want a chaotic rush that could break my own formation. I wanted a slow tightening, a controlled closing of the ring, until the strongest men among them had to admit there was no path left. I lifted my hand. Drums answered, deep and steady, like the earth itself was breathing. My infantry moved forward, my cavalry pressed in, and my horse archers kept firing, constant, relentless, denying them the one mercy they needed most, space. Then the Franks brought forward a symbol they believed could change reality. They raised what they called the true cross. They held it high as if wood could summon water, as if relics could cast shade. They carried it like a spell against death. But the sun did not care. The land did not care. And God does not rewrite the laws of thirst just because men are afraid. As the fighting closed in, the cross fell into our hands. My soldiers cried out as if they had seized the heart of the enemy itself. For them, it was proof that heaven had chosen a side. I looked at it differently. I saw it as a sign that the old order was breaking. By late afternoon, the Frankish host was shattered into desperate clusters. Banners dropped, helmets rolled through dust. Men tried to form lines and found they no longer had breath to hold them. And then came the moment that still lives in my memory like a blade's reflection in fire. They brought their king to my tent. Guy of Luciano stood there, captured, exhausted, still trying to keep the posture of a ruler. And beside him stood a man who carried hatred like perfume, Reynald of Chatillon. When I saw Reynald, the noise of the battlefield seemed to fade. In my ears, I heard older sounds: caravans under truce, prisoners bound, treaties torn like paper. I remembered the message I had sent and the contempt with which he had answered. This was not just a prisoner. This was the wound. I allowed them inside. I offered Guy a cup of chilled rosewater. It was more than generosity. In our custom, offering a captive drink is a sign of protection, an act that says, "You will live under my word." Guy drank, and I saw the tremor in his throat. Not weakness, humanity. Reynald looked at the cup like it was poison. He did not understand that the gesture was not meant for him. Guy had received the drink. Reynald had not. Reynald still lifted his chin, still carried himself like a man who believed the rules of the world were written only for other people. He spoke with the same arrogance that had made him raid under truce, the same arrogance that had kept the kingdom of Jerusalem divided even in the face of annihilation. I stood. There are moments when a man reaches the edge where explanations become unnecessary, where the past condenses into a single decision. I stepped closer, and I looked into Reynald's eyes. There was no regret there, no understanding, only the pride of a man who assumed history would forgive him because he had called himself a knight. I drew my sword. The blade caught the firelight and flared like a star, and I remembered my vow. I struck. Reynald fell, not as a legend, not as a martyr, as a man who spent his life breaking promises and finally met the price of that habit. Guy's face drained of color, his eyes fixed on the body at our feet. For a heartbeat, he looked like he might collapse into the same terror that had swallowed his army. I turned to him and spoke plainly, almost gently, because truth does not need shouting. I told him, "A king does not kill a king, but a man who breaks his oath signs his own sentence." That day at Hattin did not feel like celebration. It felt like the world shifting, because with the Frankish army broken, their fortresses would soon become shells. Cities that had stood for decades would open their gates one after another, not because they loved me, but because they could no longer believe help was coming. The coast would shake. The roads would change. The map would begin to rewrite itself. And yet, as the dust settled, I understood something else. Hattin was not the final prize. It was the key. The true prize waited on a ridge of stone, inside walls made of memory. Jerusalem. That night, I did not sleep. Outside my tent, the wind moved through the camp like a quiet messenger. Some of my men whispered again about the spirit beneath Hattin, about the god of thirst finally satisfied, returning to its sleep beneath the black rock. I did not answer them, because whether or not there was a spirit in the stone, I knew the truth. The greatest struggle was still ahead. And when Jerusalem fell, the West would not stay silent. The West would answer, and from that answer, a new enemy would rise. One that would come over the sea like a storm. When I marched toward Jerusalem, I didn't think of it as a city. I thought of it as a name that had pulled Western knights across the sea. A name that had kept this land living under war for nearly 100 years. A name that made every prayer, Christian and Muslim, feel heavier than it should. Jerusalem sits high on its ridge, like a cold brow watching the world below. And its walls are more than stone. They are memory, layered on memory, pressed into rock. After Hattin, the roads opened before me. Strongholds fell. Cities hesitated, then surrendered. The Frankish kingdom had lost the heart of its army, and suddenly the map looked fragile. But Jerusalem was different. Jerusalem is not just taken. Jerusalem is judged. When my army closed the ring around it, I gave an order that surprised some of my commanders. Tighten the siege, yes. Strike hard, yes. But do not lose yourselves. Do not let victory become chaos. Because I remembered what happened when the Franks took Jerusalem in the year 1099. I remember the stories of slaughter in the streets, of blood in holy places, of a city turned into a warning. If I reclaim Jerusalem through massacre, I might satisfy revenge for a day and create a war that would live for generations. Still, I could not afford to wait forever. Every day outside the walls pulled my empire thinner. Egypt, Syria, the borders, the rivalries. A long siege can drain the winner as surely as it starves the defeated. Inside the city, the Franks found a man to carry their last hope, Balian of Ibelin. He was not a king. He was not the man who started this war. But history does not always choose the loudest voice. Sometimes it chooses the one who refuses to break. Balian gathered what remained, men too young, men too old, men who had survived Hattin and still carried smoke in their lungs. He shaped fear into discipline, and for a time, discipline was enough. The city resisted. Our Aegean engines worked like beasts, stone after stone, striking walls that had stood for centuries. Their archers answered from above, arrows falling like iron rain. Every day the rhythm repeated, thunder from our side, defiance from theirs, and fatigue rising in both camps like a tide. After 2 weeks, I began to feel the strain in my army. Not defeat, strain. The kind that builds quietly until it becomes dangerous. That was when Balian asked to speak. First, he sent emissaries. Then he came himself. He did not crawl. He did not shout. He stood before me with the posture of a man who knew he was speaking for everyone behind those walls. Women, children, the sick, the poor, people who did not choose this war but would pay for it with their lives. He asked for mercy. He asked for safe surrender. He asked for amnesty. At first, my mind went to bitterness, to old wounds, to the violence of 1099, to the voices of those who wanted Jerusalem cleansed by revenge. But Jerusalem is not like other cities. Here, even the final sentence must be weighed like gold. Then Balian said something that changed the air between us. He told me that if I offered no mercy, there would be nothing left to govern. That if the city was doomed, they would destroy what they could before they died. They would kill Muslim prisoners held inside. They would burn homes. They would tear down what was sacred. They would turn Jerusalem into ash so that no one, neither Frank nor Muslim, could claim a true victory. It was the threat of a desperate man, but it was also a truth. A victory can rot in your hands if you win it the wrong way. I looked at him and I thought of the lessons that shaped me long before I ever stood before Jerusalem. I thought of Nur ad-Din, who taught that war must lead to order, not endless revenge. I thought of Cairo, where I learned that stability is stronger than fear. And I thought of Hattin, where I had kept an oath with blood, because an empire cannot stand on empty words. In that moment, I understood what I truly wanted. I did not want a city full of corpses. I wanted legitimacy, a future, a peace that could actually hold. So I offered terms. Not soft terms, not foolish terms, but terms that avoided disaster. People could ransom themselves, families could buy freedom, and for those without money, there would be help, ransom funds, mercy where mercy could be given. Christian holy places would be protected. Pilgrims would still be allowed to come in peace. Some would call that weakness, but I knew it was strength, because restraint is not the opposite of power. Restraint is what proves you possess it. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem opened its gates. When I entered, I did not ride like a man drunk of triumph. I moved like someone handling something fragile. I felt the weight of every eye, my soldiers, the city's people, and the invisible eyes of history itself. My men like to tell a story about that day. They say that when I stepped through the gate, the wind changed direction, that the harsh air softened, as if the city had been holding its breath for decades, and finally exhaled. I will not claim miracles, but I will tell you what I felt. I saw the dome of the rock, gold above ancient stone, and for a moment the noise of war fell away. I did not feel childish joy. I felt responsibility, the kind that presses down on your shoulders when you realize your choices will echo long after you are gone. Jerusalem was mine, and yet I knew, even then, it was not the end. Because somewhere beyond the sea, bells would begin to ring, oaths would be sworn, kings would start to move. And along the coast, Tyre still held, stubborn, defiant, impossible to crush quickly. That one surviving thorn would become a gathering point, a spark kept alive in the wind. Jerusalem had returned to my hands, but the West would not accept silence. The West would answer. And in that answer, I could already sense the outline of the man who would come for me. Steel-willed, battle-hungry, carried by the sea like a storm. A king they would call the Lionheart. When news of Jerusalem reached the West, it didn't arrive like a letter. It arrived like a blow to the chest. In their churches, bells began to ring with a different kind of urgency. In their courts, men spoke the city's name the way soldiers speak a fallen comrade, half grief, half fury. And in Rome, the call went out once again. Take up the cross, go east, take the holy city back. Some men answered because they believed in salvation. Some answered because they feared shame. And some answered because war was the only language they had ever truly mastered. From across the sea, I began to hear one name more often than any other: Richard. In the West, they would call him the Lionheart, but no man is born with a title like that. A lion is made by hunger, by blood, by the kind of life that never lets you rest. Richard was shaped by a world that turned family into battlefield. His father was Henry II of England. His mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, famous, feared, and filled with a kind of crusading fire that turned ambition into destiny. In their house, love and power wrestled like wolves in the dark. Sons rose against fathers. Brothers measured each other's worth with steel and betrayal. Richard learned early that a crown is not worn, it is defended. He learned politics the way a soldier learns terrain. He learned warfare the way a storm learns the shape of a coastline. And he gained a reputation that spread faster than any messenger could ride. Brave, brilliant, and capable of cruelty when cruelty served the goal. There was a story told about him in France before he ever wore the crown of England. A fortress on a cliff, built to be unbreakable, 3 sides protected by sheer rock, the 4th locked behind trenches and layered walls, the kind of place men called a no-win siege. Richard took it anyway. Not by starving it for months, not by hurling thousands into the walls. He used deception. He burned the countryside where the defenders could see it, day after day, until anger pulled them out of their safety. He made his camp look smaller than it was. He hid his numbers, and when they finally opened their gates to strike him, he ambushed them, routed them, and chased them back through their own entrance. That was the pattern of his mind. He didn't just fight, he made you fight the wrong battle. So when Jerusalem fell and the West began to howl for a new crusade, Richard heard something more than a religious summons. He heard an invitation to glory. But even then, he was not yet free to sail. A man cannot wage holy war abroad if he is still trapped in civil war at home. Richard's path to the east first ran through the poisoned roots of his own dynasty. He fought his father, then reconciled, then fought again. He joined hands with Philip of France when it suited him, and turned away when it didn't. Alliances in the West were like sand, shifted by every gust of advantage. And then, in the summer of 1189, his father finally broke. Henry II died defeated and exhausted, and Richard stepped into the role he had been born to claim. He became King of England, and almost immediately he began to strip his kingdom down into fuel for war. Men later said Richard would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. That may be an exaggeration, the kind chroniclers love, but the truth beneath it is real. He raised money with relentless focus. He gathered ships, horses, steel, and men. He prepared like a commander who understood the one rule that governs all wars, no matter how holy the slogans sound. Logistics decides what faith only promises. And Richard was not the only ruler to arise. Another giant moved in the West, Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, a veteran of earlier Crusades, disciplined, methodical, terrifying in scale. He marched east over land with what many claimed was a vast host. Some numbers were surely inflated by rumor, but even half of them would have been enough to make any ruler feel the air grow colder. When my advisors spoke his name, they spoke more carefully, because a great army does not need to win every battle. Sometimes its mere arrival changes what is possible. Barbarossa pushed through the Balkans, fought across Anatolia, and even seized the Seljuk capital at Iconium. For a time, it looked like the West had sent not a crusade, but a moving empire. Then history laughed in its own cruel way. In the summer of 1190, Barbarossa died not to a sword, but to a river, a small crossing, heat, heavy armor, cold water. One moment of misfortune, and the great emperor drowned. A man can spend his life defeating armies and still be taken by something as simple as a current. His army began to fracture. Many turned back. The threat diminished. But Richard did not. Richard kept moving. And the more I heard of him, the more I understood the shape of what was coming. Jerusalem had fallen, yes, but what they were truly sending now was not just soldiers. They were sending a rival will. A king who would not be satisfied with raids and gestures. A king who would insist on confronting me where legends are made, in open battle,
before witnesses, under a sky that remembers. My storytellers in Damascus liked to dress it up. They said a lion had awakened in the far west, and with each step it took, the earth trembled like a drum. They said the sea itself would carry him as if it had sworn an oath. I didn't answer those tales. I've learned that myths are useful but dangerous. They can inflate a man until he believes he is more than mortal, and then the first real wound becomes a shock he cannot endure. Still, that night I stood longer than usual and looked toward the Mediterranean, not because I believed in omens, because I believed in patterns. Jerusalem had fallen, the West had answered, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a king was coming, one who did not fear distance, one who fed on war, one who would step onto my shores and force the next chapter into being. And I knew, with the calm certainty that comes before storms, the war was not ending, it was changing its face.
The Mediterranean is not just water, it is a road. And on that road, fate has a habit of overturning the plans of men who think they are untouchable. Richard left Sicily with a massive fleet, but the sea did what the sea always does. It reminded every king that he is still a passenger. A storm scattered his ships. Some were lost, some limped to shore, and part of that broken armada drifted to Cyprus. Cyprus should have been nothing more than a stop, a place to take water, repair sails, and move on. But Cyprus was ruled by a man who had crowned himself emperor, Isaac Komnenos, an exile from the Byzantine world who governed the island like a tyrant and treated visitors like prey. He made a mistake that sounds small until you understand who Richard was. He insulted Richard's sister. He insulted Richard's betrothed. He seized treasure. He refused even the basic courtesies of fresh water and safe harbor. And worst of all, he spoke as if being an emperor placed him above a mere king. If there is one thing you learn quickly in this era, it is this. You do not humiliate a warlord and expect him to continue his journey politely. Richard landed. The fighting on Cyprus was fast, violent, and almost unfair. Richard's forces were fewer but disciplined, hardened soldiers who moved like a blade instead of a crowd. Crossbows snapped, knights charged, the island's defenders broke. Isaac ran, then ran again, from one strong point to the next, until there was nowhere left to run. The story my enemies like to tell about that surrender has the flavor of cruel humor. They say Isaac begged Richard never to chain him in iron, because years of captivity had left him terrified of chains. Richard agreed, no iron chains. Then he had chains made of silver, and bound the emperor in those instead. Maybe the detail has been polished by time. Maybe it has been sharpened into a legend. But the lesson is true either way. Richard did not simply conquer Cyprus. He bent it. And he gained more than territory. He gained a base, ports, grain, shipyards, and a position in the sea that could feed an army like a beating heart. A crusade can preach about faith all it wants. It survives on supplies. Richard understood that as naturally as breathing. While he was securing Cyprus, the coast of the Levant was already burning around a different struggle. Acre. Acre was not just a city, it was a gate, a wealthy port with thick walls, a marketplace that linked continents, and a harbor that could nourish whoever held it. If the Franks possessed Acre, they could breathe. If they lost it, their foothold in the Holy Land would shrink to a memory. After Hattin, I had released Guy of Lusignan. Some called it mercy. In truth, it was strategy. A weakened king set loose can become a wedge among rivals. I wanted the Franks divided. Gui did what desperate men do when they still crave power. He gathered what forces he could and marched on Acre in the year 1189, beginning a siege that quickly turned into a nightmare. Because Acre was not a simple siege, it became a double siege. The Crusaders pressed the city from the outside, while my armies pressed the Crusaders from the outside of their own camps. The besiegers became the besieged. Lines of earthworks grew longer, deeper, stronger. Disease spread, hunger spread, bodies filled ditches, and still the city held. For nearly 2 years, the siege dragged on like a chain. Then came reinforcements from the west. Philip of France came first, and the Crusader camp gained strength. But it was still unstable. Too many lords, too many rival claims, too many private ambitions competing inside the same holy cause. Then Richard arrived, and the atmosphere changed. Even before he reached Acre, Richard captured a vital supply ship sent to relieve the city, loaded with provisions and men. When that ship went down, it was as if a lifeline had been cut in plain sight. When Richard finally reached the siege lines, he took command like a man stepping into his natural element. The chroniclers say he was sick with fever at times, but still demanded to be carried out where he could see the walls, where he could be seen by his men. They say he used a crossbow from his stretcher, picking targets on the battlements as if sheer will could replace health. Under his leadership, the pressure became relentless. Siege engines were assembled, towers rolled forward, stones struck the walls day after day until the defenses began to crack. Inside Acre, my garrison sent urgent messages, requests for relief, pleas for rescue. I struck the Crusader lines to distract them, to buy time, to let the defenders rebuild. But time was no longer generous. The city was starving, and the sea, controlled by Crusader ships, tightened like a fist around the harbor. On the 12th of July, 1191, Acre surrendered. Richard had won the first round, but victory created a new problem: prisoners. Thousands of Muslim captives now sat in Richard's hands. Ransoms were demanded. Negotiations began. Richard wanted speed. He wanted to move south towards the ports that would open a path to Jerusalem. I needed time. Time to concentrate forces. Time to reposition. Time to keep the Crusaders from turning this coastal foothold into a dagger pointed at the heart of my rule. So the talks dragged. And the longer they dragged, the sharper Richard became. Then came the moment when the war crossed into darker water. Richard ordered a mass execution of the captives near Acre. Many chroniclers speak of roughly 2,700 men. In response, my side killed prisoners as well. After that, whatever fragile illusion of clean chivalry remained between us was burned away. The Crusade had stepped into a colder age. And even within the Crusader ranks, cracks widened. Philip of France, ill and resentful, chose to leave the Holy Land. He returned to Europe swearing promises on departure, but carrying ambition in his shadow. Richard remained, essentially alone among kings, brilliant, furious, and now unchallenged within his own camp. From that moment, the struggle became clearer than ever. It was no longer just Crusaders against Muslims. It was Richard against me. A king who had turned an island into a supply base, who had taken Acre as a statement, who believed that daring could force history to kneel. And me holding Jerusalem, holding an empire stitched together by will, knowing that I could not afford to lose a single decisive battle, because my strength was not just in soldiers, it was in balance. In the days that followed, Richard rebuilt Acre, reorganized his forces, and prepared to march along the coast. He had the sea at his side, feeding him, shielding him, keeping his army alive. I watched, and I understood the shape of what was coming. The real contest had begun. Two commanders,
Two worlds, two legends moving towards the same narrow strip of land where only one story could be told at a time.
I heard that Richard had left Acre the way a man hears a door slam behind him. Not because I feared an army, but because I understood what an army becomes when it's disciplined and commanded by a mind built for war. Richard didn't move like a pilgrim carrying a vow. He moved like a hunter who knows the terrain is part of the weapon. He marched south along the coast, keeping the sea to his right so his ships could shadow him like a floating fortress. Where I burned fields and broke storehouses, the sea replaced them. Where I tried to starve him, the sea fed him. Salt wind carried grain and steel as if the water itself had chosen a side. So I chose the land that the sea could not soften. North of Arsuf there was a strip of woodland and low hills, one of the rare places in this country where shade exists in the open, where an army can be swallowed by uneven ground. A small stream ran nearby, thin and stubborn, lined with reeds that trembled in the wind like spears. My commanders wanted a glorious clash. They wanted to crash into the Franks and end it in one roaring day. But I remembered Hattin, and I remembered Montgisard. I remembered how a single mistake can make victory dissolve into shame. I did not want glory. I wanted control. So I positioned my forces on the higher ground and in the cover of trees. I told my men to sit in silence, to let the enemy come close enough to feel safe, close enough to believe the road was clear. Then we would strike where it hurt most, at the edges, at the rear, at the horses. A Frankish knight without his horse is still dangerous, but he is no longer a storm. He becomes a man trapped in metal. Richard approached with a caution that annoyed me. He didn't rush. He kept formation. He rested his men when water appeared. He stopped where the ground favored him. He let discipline do what courage alone cannot. Watching him, I felt something I rarely allow myself to feel toward an enemy. Respect. Not for his cause, for his method. On the morning of the 7th of September, 1191, I released the attack. My horse archers poured down from the hills like a sudden weather change. Arrows didn't fall in one dramatic wave. They came in constant pulses, sting, withdraw, sting again, like a swarm that never fully lands. I wasn't trying to win a duel of strength. I was trying to break a machine. We struck the rear, where the Hospitallers guarded the tail of the column. We struck the spaces between units, the moments where fatigue creates gaps. We struck horses, because a fallen horse is more than loss of movement. It's loss of order, loss of confidence, loss of the lie that an armored knight is invincible. Richard held them together. He refused to chase. He refused to let his cavalry burst out in anger. I could almost feel his command moving down his lines like a spine. Hold formation, hold formation, hold formation. His men suffered, you could see it. Armor turned into an oven under the sun. Their horses screamed when arrows struck. Their faces, when they lifted their visors, looked like men swallowing fire. And still they held. Some of my soldiers began to whisper their own stories as the day wore on. They said Richard wasn't a man, but a lion wearing human skin, and his roar was discipline. They said anyone who broke formation would be devoured by the enemy or by their own king. I don't believe in battlefield spirits, but I do believe in morale. And I could feel the moment my own commanders began to wonder if their arrows were enough. Then something happened that looked at first like the opening I had been waiting for. The Hospitallers could not endure it any longer. They had lost too many horses. They had been pressed too hard. And pride is a kind of hunger, finally pushed them past obedience. They charged without orders. For a heartbeat, I believed the day had turned in my favor. A charge launched too early, too isolated, should be swallowed. I signaled for my lines to tighten, to catch them, to crush them before Richard could react. But history has a taste for sudden turns. That unauthorized charge spread through the Frankish column like a snapped rope. First the rear surged, then the center, then the front, and suddenly what I had tried to force into a slow collapse became something else entirely, a wave. And Richard, as if he had been waiting for the exact second the wave could be turned into a weapon, unleashed his heavy cavalry. The Frankish charge slammed into my lines with a weight that arrows cannot stop once it reaches you. My men were swift and skilled, but speed becomes weakness when you are caught at close distance by armored riders moving as one. The first ranks broke, then others wavered, and in war, a small wavering at the wrong moment becomes a crack. A crack becomes a flood. I ordered a withdrawal to higher ground. I refused to let a setback turn into a rout. My army was damaged, but not destroyed. The empire did not fall because of one hard day. Still, Arsuf was not nothing. Arsuf was a blow to my prestige. My emirs watched me with a new calculation in their eyes, the look of men who begin to ask questions they never asked when victory felt inevitable. That night I sat alone and listened to the sea wind tug at the ropes of the tents. I thought of Hattin, where everything had been perfect. I thought of how clean victory had looked from the heights. And then I thought of Arsuf, the messy truth that even the best plan can be twisted by one act of desperation, one moment where discipline changes shape. I told myself something I would not forget again. Do not fight Richard in the way Richard wants. No more grand set-piece battles where his heavy cavalry can turn the field into a slaughterhouse of momentum. From now on, the war would return to the language this land speaks best. Harass, withdraw, burn, cut roots, poison certainty, deny water, deny rest. Let the desert and the distance do what no army can do forever. Richard won at Arsuf. He won the kind of victory that turns a king into legend among his men. But Jerusalem was not at Arsuf. Jerusalem lay inland, behind ridges and stone, behind wells I could foul, behind roads I could make deadly, behind empty ground where steel grows heavy and prayers grow desperate. So I made a decision that pained me because it meant damaging my own land to deny it to him. Jaffa and Ascalon, ports that could feed a march toward Jerusalem, had to be broken, or at least crippled. If Richard could secure them, the sea would give him an artery straight into the heart of Palestine. When his army reached Jaffa, he found ruin, walls torn, streets silent, buildings reduced to bone. But ruins can be rebuilt. And Richard did what great commanders always do when they cannot move forward yet.
He built. He restored. He fortified. He turned wreckage into a foothold, and he did it with the patience of a man who understood that every stone placed correctly is worth 100 heroic speeches. As the weeks passed, I watched his campfires on the coast, and I felt the season begin to turn. Winter would come, rain would fall, roads would become mud, disease would rise. Man would lose courage in cold just as quickly as they lose it in thirst. The battle at Arsuf declared one truth to the world. The Lionheart had arrived. And if I wanted to keep Jerusalem, I would have to defeat him not with a single perfect strike, but with endurance, with restraint, with the slow, merciless intelligence of survival.
Richard moved toward Jerusalem the way a careful man approaches a locked door. Not with a shout, not with a reckless charge, but with his ear against the wood, listening for what waits on the other side. He didn't march like the men who came before him. He didn't throw everything forward just to say he had tried. He understood something that many knights refuse to admit out loud. Taking Jerusalem is one thing. Holding it is something else entirely. To hold a city like that, you need more than courage. You need roads. You need water. You need ports. You need time. And time is a currency no army can mint for itself. So, he built his war along the coast. He treated the shoreline like a spine, letting ships feed his army, letting the sea protect his flank. Where I tried to starve him, the sea answered with grain. Where I tried to exhaust him, the sea answered with rest and reinforcement. I responded the only way this land can respond when it is threatened by an army that refuses to die quickly. I denied him the land. I ordered wells ruined, cisterns smashed, supplies removed, storehouses emptied. The chroniclers would later call it cruelty. My men, trying to live with what they had done, gave it another name. They spoke of jinn in the wells, spirits that cried at night when the water was spoiled, as if mythology could soften the truth. But the truth is simple. Jerusalem is held by water as much as it is held by walls. If you control the wells and the roads, you control the possibility of siege. If you poison the certainty of supply, you poison the enemy's confidence. By late 1191, the season changed. Rain came in hard slants. Wind cut through cloth and armor. Roads turned into mud that swallowed carts and slowed horses. In the cold, even a strong army starts to think differently. Hunger bites harder. Illness spreads faster. Hope becomes heavier to carry. Richard still moved forward, but now every step demanded twice the effort. And then he reached Beit Nuba, close enough that Jerusalem felt like it was standing just beyond the next ridge. Some of his men said they could almost see the city in the distance, like a pale dream on the horizon. In a camp like that, excitement becomes contagious. Soldiers begin to speak as if victory has already happened. They argue about who will lead the assault, whose banner will rise first, which gate will fall. But Richard did not speak like a man drunk of nearness. He looked at the ground, at the weather, at the length of his supply line, and at the unseen army that waited for him, my army. He understood what would happen if he took Jerusalem and then lost his route back to the sea. He understood that a captured city, cut off and surrounded, becomes a trap, a trophy that turns into a tomb. So, he did what few kings have the courage to do when their men are begging for glory. He pulled back. When I heard the news, I won't pretend I felt nothing. A weight lifted in my chest. Not joy, relief. Jerusalem was still mine, and the winter had not become a battlefield of desperation outside its walls. I dismissed part of my forces, sending men home, keeping only what was necessary. An empire cannot keep its entire strength under arms forever. Fields still need hands, taxes still need collecting, cities still need order. War may be holy in sermons, but in reality it runs on ordinary life. Yet I could not allow myself to believe it was over, because Richard didn't retreat to surrender. He retreated to prepare. He turned his attention to Beit Nuba. City was not just a coastal city. It was a hinge between Egypt and Syria, one of the few places that could connect an army's movement north and south with real strength. Earlier, I had made the painful decision to damage it, because I understood that if Richard held Ascalon, he would have a knife pressed against the arteries of my empire. Now, Richard began rebuilding it, stone by stone, wall by wall. He raised what had been broken. He restored the port, shaped the fences, and turned a ruin into a tool. Watching him, I felt the same irritation I had felt at Arsuf. This was not a man who relied on luck. He was methodical. And while the Franks were rebuilding their foothold, another enemy did what enemies always do best. They fought each other. Within the Crusader camp, the question of who should rule what remained of the kingdom of Jerusalem still burned like an open wound. Guy of Lusignan claimed the crown, but his authority was weak. Conrad of Montferrat, holding Tyre, strong, ambitious, difficult to bend, offered an alternative. Richard had supported Guy at first. Then, under pressure to unite his side, he shifted towards Conrad. Nothing in the Crusader camp stayed simple for long. Every alliance had a shadow. Every promise had a price. And then, in the spring of 1192, history struck with a dagger in a marketplace. On April 28th, Conrad of Montferrat was murdered in Tyre by assassins, men who moved like whispers and vanished like smoke. Rumors raced faster than truth. Some crusaders suspected Richard. Some whispered my name. Some spoke of the shadowy order behind the killers, men they called the Old Man of the Mountain. I will tell you this. War creates so much noise that even honest men can no longer hear what is real. But the result was undeniable. The Crusader leadership fractured again. Richard tried to hold it together, but even as he struggled to keep his camp united, another pressure began closing around him from the far side of the world. Messages came from Europe. Philip of France was moving against Richard's lands. Richard's brother, John, was testing the limits of loyalty, reaching for power like a thief reaching for a loose purse in the dark. Richard was a king, yes, but he was also a man, and no man can ignore the sound of his own house catching fire. I understood then that time was becoming my ally, not because I was stronger in every battle, not because I had endless soldiers, but because Richard's war had two fronts, even if only one of them was visible to the men around him. He was trapped between two vows, the vow of the cross and the vow of the crown.
And when a lion is pulled in two directions, it may roar louder, but it will also tire sooner. Still, I did not mistake fatigue for defeat. Richard would try again. He could not return home without one last attempt to justify the sacrifice, the blood, the ships, the gold. He needed something he could hold up to the West and say, "This is what your crusade achieved." And I knew exactly what that something was: Jerusalem. So I prepared as a man prepares when he senses the enemy will return one final time. Not with certainty, but with desperate resolve. I held the city. I watched the roads. I listened for movement, because the next approach would not be slow and hopeful like the first. It would be fast, strained, and hungry for an ending. And in wars like this, the most dangerous thing is not confidence. It is the need to prove you did not come all this way for nothing. In the summer of 1192, Richard gathered his strength and aimed toward Jerusalem again. This time, the march felt different. The heat was sharper. The men were more silent. The songs sounded forced, like prayers spoken through a dry throat. Some of the Franks believed that if they sang loudly enough, God would make the road easier. But roads do not soften for hymns. I gave orders that the chroniclers would later call harsh. Wells around Jerusalem were damaged, springs were fouled, cisterns were broken where they could be reached. It was not done out of cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was done because I had learned the oldest lesson of this land. Water wins wars. I had won at Hattin by thirst, and I would keep Jerusalem by thirst if I had to. Richard reached the forward positions again, near Beit Nuba, close enough that the holy city was almost within reach. His camp buzzed with expectation. Men spoke as if victory was already a fact. They argued about who would lead, which wall would be breached first, whose banner would rise over the city. And then Richard did something that made many of his own followers hate him in that moment. He pulled back again. It would be easy to call it fear. Many did. But fear is not always weakness. Sometimes fear is simply the mind seeing farther than the heart wants to see. Richard understood that he could take Jerusalem and still lose the war. He could capture the city and then be cut off from the sea, from supplies, from water, surrounded by my forces, trapped in a sacred stone cage with no way out. A victory like that would become a mass grave. A triumph that turns into a disaster is the kind of story that breaks a king. So he retreated. When I heard, I felt relief, but not celebration, because I also understood what it meant. Richard was running out of time. He could not go home with nothing. He needed an achievement he could hold, defend, and present to the West as proof that the crusade had not been a meaningless bleeding. And that need would push him into risk. He returned to the coast. Jaffa, one of the vital ports, became the key again. Whoever controlled Jaffa controlled the breadth of the Crusader foothold. And when I realized Richard was away from the city and his forces were stretched, I saw my chance. I moved on Jaffa in late July of 1192. The siege began quickly. My men struck hard. Parts of the defenses collapsed. The garrison fought with fierce desperation, then retreated into the citadel. For a moment, it looked like Jaffa would fall completely, and with it, the Crusader grip on the coast would tighten into a fist that could no longer hold. But Richard was not the kind of king who watched the coast burn from a safe distance. He did something only a man driven by pride and courage would dare to do. He gathered a small force, only a handful of knights, a few hundred infantry, and skilled crossbowmen, and he sailed straight for Jaffa. When his ships appeared, the sea itself seemed to shift mood. The Franks would later say the water opened for him, as if heaven had cleared a path. I do not believe the sea takes orders from saints. I believe Richard simply moved faster than anyone expected. He landed while the siege was still hot. He jumped into the surf before he was fully armored and fought his way ashore with the urgency of a man who cannot afford hesitation. The attack hit my forces on the flank with such sudden violence that many of my soldiers broke and fell back. It was not cowardice, it was shock, the kind that happens when a battle you think is under control suddenly turns into an ambush in reverse. Jaffa was not lost that day because my army was weak. It was saved because Richard was reckless in exactly the right moment. But I was not finished. I regrouped outside the city. I pulled my men together, and I prepared a dawn strike meant to catch Richard before he could settle. I concealed forces in the fields, in the low ground, hoping to hit him when his men were tired and scattered. And then a small thing ruined a large plan. A Frankish soldier, out early, wandering, searching, perhaps only trying to breathe, noticed movement where there should have been none. He sounded the alarm. Richard reacted instantly. He drove long stakes into the ground, making a wall of sharpened wood that cavalry could not break without bleeding itself to death. Behind that barrier he placed his crossbowmen, heavily armored, steady, lethal, while keeping his knights in reserve. When my attack came, it met that wall. My horsemen could not surge through the stakes. They slowed, bunched, and became targets. Crossbow bolts began to fall in a steady, brutal rhythm. Not a dramatic storm, but a methodical harvest. Then, when my line faltered, Richard released his knights. The counterattack struck the center like a hammer. What followed was not a clean battle. It was a struggle in dust and noise, a tangled fight where men died close enough to feel each other's breath. In the middle of it, Richard fought the way legends are born. Frankish chroniclers said arrows stuck into his armor until he looked like a porcupine, and still he did not fall. Muslim stories did not deny his courage. There is another tale told about that day, and like many tales, it may have grown larger than the truth. They say Richard lost his horse, and seeing a king on foot in the middle of battle, I sent him horses so that he would not fight like a common soldier. Whether that specific moment happened exactly as the storytellers claim matters less than the spirit behind it, because I will tell you this plainly. I respected Richard. Not as a brother, not as a friend, never that, but as a man who carried his role without flinching. Respect does not erase war. It does not soften steel. But it can keep war from turning into madness. Jaffa did not deliver a final victory for either of us. It delivered clarity. I could not drive the Franks into the sea as long as Richard lived and could move. Richard could not reach Jerusalem without turning his army into a hostage of distance and thirst. We had reached the edge of what force could decide. After Jaffa, the air between our camps changed, not to peace, never peace, but to the exhausted understanding that even great men can only stretch a war so far before it begins to consume the hands holding it. And so the war began to speak another language: negotiation. Not because either side suddenly became merciful, but because both sides finally saw the same truth in the sand. This conflict would not end with a single heroic charge. It would end when one of us ran out of time.
By the end of the summer, in the year 1192, Richard and I finally understood something neither of us wanted to admit. We were fighting inside a circle, and no matter how hard we struck, the circle would not break. I held Jerusalem, but my empire was tired. An empire is not an endless well. Men have fields to return to. Cities have taxes to collect. Emirs have their own calculations. A ruler can gather a great host, yes, but he cannot keep it gathered forever without the whole structure beginning to crack. Richard was tired too, though he hid it behind iron and pride. He could still win battles, still shock armies with daring, but time had turned against him in a way no sword could cut. In the West, his kingdom was in danger. Philip of France was moving against Richard's lance. His brother John was reaching for power. A king can leave home for holy war for a year, even for 2, but not forever, not if he wants to return to a throne that still belongs to him. And so the war changed its language, not into friendship, not into forgiveness, into terms. We negotiated in the shadow of exhaustion, and what emerged was a compromise that satisfied no one, but spared what could still be spared. In early September of 1192, we agreed to what many would later call the Treaty of Jaffa, sometimes the Treaty of Ramla. The Franks would keep a strip of coastal cities, from Tyre down to Jaffa, enough to give them a foothold, enough to give them ports, enough to let their world say they had not been driven completely into the sea. Ascalon, that hinge between Egypt and Syria, would return to me, its walls dismantled, so it could not become a blade held against my empire again. And Christian pilgrims would be allowed to come to Jerusalem peacefully. No banners planted on the Temple Mount by Richard, no crusader throne restored as it once was, no total destruction of my power. A draw, a hard, unsatisfying draw, but sometimes a draw is what keeps the future from turning into a deeper nightmare. When Richard prepared to leave, the stories say he stood at the back of his ship and stared towards the shore until the coast shrank into the horizon. I can imagine it clearly, because I have seen that look in the eyes of commanders before. It is the look of a man who touched a dream and could not hold it. Jerusalem remained in my hands, and yet even I did not feel triumph the way I once imagined I would. I felt weight, because I knew what the world rarely admits. Even the greatest victories are temporary. They are held together by the breath of the men who won them, and that breath does not last forever. Richard sailed away in October, and not long after, fate took its payment from me as well. On the 4th of March, 1193, I died in Damascus. I had spent my life gathering men, gathering cities, gathering power.
Yet in the end, the thing people remembered most was not how much gold I held, but how little I kept. They said I gave away nearly everything, to the poor, to charity, to those who had nothing. They said there was barely enough left to pay for my own burial. Some called that holiness. Some called it a sad ending. I called it clarity. When you have seen enough war, gold begins to feel like dust in the hand. You can close your fingers around it, but it always slips through. After my death, my empire began to fracture. That is the fate of many realms built by one will. When the will disappears, the structure shakes. Sons quarrel, allies drift, rivals return, and the unity that once felt inevitable begins to look like something fragile that had been held together by the sheer force of one man refusing to let go. Richard's story did not end cleanly either. On his way home, he was captured near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria and held for ransom. A king who had crossed seas and fought empires was reduced for a time to a prisoner behind walls, proof that the world does not always reward courage with safety. He was released in early 1194, and he returned to war as if peace was a language he never fully learned. Then, in the spring of 1199, during a siege in France, he was struck by a crossbow bolt, a small wound, the kind of wound that seems almost insulting to a man who lived through so much steel. Infection followed, and Richard died. But there is one detail about his ending that even his enemies could not easily dismiss. Before he died, he forgave the man who shot him. Some would call that mercy. Some would call it pride. Some would say it was the final act of a man who wanted to shape the legend that would survive him. Maybe it was all of those things. Or maybe, in the face of death, he simply recognized what every great commander eventually recognizes. No one fully owns his fate. And after Richard and I passed into history, the world did what it always does. It kept moving forward. More crusades were called, more vows were sworn, more men marched under holy symbols, but not all of them marched towards holiness. Not all of them marched towards Jerusalem. A few years later, another crusade would be summoned, one that would not even reach the Holy Land the way it was meant to. Instead, it would turn towards Constantinople, a Christian city, and it would fall not to faith, but to greed. That is what old soldiers sometimes whispered around the fire when they spoke of our war and what came after. Jerusalem makes men speak in God's name, but men still betray God, often before they betray each other. And if I had to leave one final thought behind, not as a sultan, but as a man who watched war long enough to understand its shape, it would be this: Jerusalem is stone. Men are sand. Stone remains as centuries pass. Sand is carried by the wind, taking with it oaths, blood, and stories, until the stories become legends, and the legends become warnings.